Welcome, everybody. I want to start today with something that's really interesting, but not super surprising, which is that the United States coronavirus vaccination map looks just like the 2020 presidential election results map. If you want to predict which states voted for Trump, look at the states that aren't really getting vaccinated at the higher rates in the country. If you want to predict which states are getting vaccinated, look at the list of states where Joe Biden got more of a share of the vote relative to Donald Trump. And it's actually incredible how accurately this can predict vaccination. If you look at the top 25 states in terms of what portion of the population has been vaccinated, Joe Biden won 21 of those 25 states in the 2020 election. When you look at the bottom 25 states in terms of vaccination rate, Donald Trump won 21 of those 25 states, including 16 of the worst 17 states when it comes to vaccination. The correlation between vaccination rate and the 2020 election outcome by state has strengthened over time. And that's another important thing to consider. We've talked about how anti-vaccine sentiment has declined over time, even among Republicans. Like, for example, last month, 43% of Republicans didn't want the vaccine. This month, only 41% of Republicans don't want the vaccine. Even within that, if you are a Republican in a blue state, you are far more likely to want a vaccine than if you are a Republican in a red state. Now, in addition to this, there's a big urban-rural divide when it comes to vaccination, just like there's an urban-rural divide in Trump versus Biden. But let's put some visuals to this for people who are watching us today. Check out some of these images from acasignups.net. This is a chart of vaccination rate versus Trump support at the state level. And you see that the numbers are arranged along a diagonal line. To the right, it is a higher Trump vote, and you see a lower vaccination rate. It's just a perfect plot. To the left is a higher Biden vote, and you see much higher vaccination rates. Now, you could say, hold on a second, David. Hold on, sir. States vary in population. You have really big blue states, you have some really small red states. So if you just look at states, that could be deceptive. It might not really give us an accurate picture of this. The second image here from acasignups.net is county by county. And similarly, although you have more outliers, like there are some blue counties where very few people want to get vaccinated. I would love to know where those are, but it's basically the same pattern. Higher Trump vote, lower vaccination, higher Biden vote, higher vaccination. And it only requires thinking back to the last, 15, 16 months to understand what's going on here. If you have been told for a year by your fearless leader, this isn't serious, this is like the flu, 15 cases will soon be 0. We don't need masks. We don't need to close. We need kids in schools. You might get the sense that you don't really need a vaccine, and thus you aren't going to go and get yourself one. Trump said it would be gone in April, last April of April, not 1 month ago, 13 months ago. Why would you need a vaccine for that? But the real tragedy here is that politicizing the tax rate, politicizing debt and deficit, that's one thing. If something that is simply a public health measure that saves lives, like a vaccination that is 90+% effective, if that can fall into the same political traps, the same political games, then quite literally anything can. And that's a horrifying reality to have to accept. There are Trumpists now posting to social media like a badge of honor that they have not and they will not get vaccinated, and the government's not going to tread on them and force them to get vaccinated. Well, yeah, no, the government's not going to force you to do it. Of course, we know that. But they are wearing this lack of vaccination as a badge of honor now. So at the end of the day, Trump's politicization of the pandemic continues. Trump's gone, but it will continue to cause deaths, American deaths, due to this anti-vaccine sentiment. And increasingly, because of this partisan split, Trump's mishandling and propagandizing around the pandemic will lead to more Republican deaths than Democratic deaths, as we have increasingly. I mean, there are blue states that are at 70% vaccinated already. That's essentially herd immunity. Cases are going to zero almost statistically. Not literally zero, statistical zero, where you get down to a number that, the rate of reproduction is extremely low. This is an incredible situation because it is going to take on an incredible partisan divide as we go forward with red state and Republican clusters of the virus. It's a horrible thing. And I don't care what your partisan identification is. I don't want anybody to die. I don't want anybody to get sick. And we are very quickly seeing an incredible red-blue divide happening when it comes to vaccination. Okay, so I tweeted about this yesterday and got some really interesting responses. So I decided to talk about it today. I've been self-censoring on the program, or censoring myself, as some would say, over the issue of recent anti-Semitic attacks all over the world, all over the country and all over the world. My instinct is never to do this. If there's a story that I want to cover, I cover the story. But I will be very honest with you. The degree of anti-Semitism that we've received across all platforms over the last 2 weeks, just for my coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, without actually talking about anti-Semitism really, has been insane. We have had to ban hundreds and hundreds of people across our platforms, from everything from calling me a Jew rat to people saying blow up all Jews, blow up Israel, which I consider to be just as unproductive as those people who claim that the pro-Israeli side wants to blow up all Palestinians. Like it's just as disgusting. And I did something that I don't feel great about, which is I didn't do a story that I wanted to do. Since last week, I wanted to do a story about how criticism of the Israeli government and foreign policy, which is valid and in which I participate myself and have for a long time, that has become cover for, fuel for, an opening for just out and out anti-Semitism and even physical violence against random Jewish people or people believed to be Jewish out on the streets. Normally, I'd be telling you, but I haven't, about all of these different things. And yesterday I tweeted, if I'm completely honest, I hesitate to do a segment covering the anti-Semitic attacks and beatings of the last week because I don't have the stomach for the deluge of anti-Semitism that such a segment would trigger against me. Even the responses to that tweet were filled with anti-Semitic comments, which immediately led to me just blocking a whole bunch of people. And I'm not going to highlight any of those messages today. But I've decided to talk about this today, partially because of some of the positive responses I received, and also because it's already not being talked about enough. As I see coverage of this issue, the anti-Semitic attacks are already not getting enough coverage. And if I don't talk about it, I'm helping for it to be erased. And I can't do that. Now, for some reason, there are some on the left who do not talk about anti-Semitism, either because they believe it conflicts with their views about Israeli foreign policy, which is a different topic. Israeli foreign policy and anti-Semitism are two different topics, unless you only talk about the former to hide the latter, but that's a very specific case. Some on the left don't talk about anti-Semitism because they see Jewish Americans as an elite privileged group, which in and of itself is actually based on an anti-Semitic trope. So I know that this is going to be a mess. I know we'll have to block another few hundred people, but we have to talk about what's been going on. For example, 3 men went to a synagogue in New York City, made anti-Semitic comments to just 4 dudes hanging out outside, and vandalized the synagogue. A synagogue in Chicago has been vandalized. Thursday night, a random Jewish man in New York City's Times Square was beaten up just in the middle of the street, a beating. 29-year-old with a yarmulke in New York City, assaulted by a violent mob, called a filthy Jew, a dirty Jew, saying Hamas will kill all of you and Israel will burn. Guys, that's not a criticism of Israeli foreign policy. That's anti-Semitism. In Los Angeles, a group of people went to a sushi restaurant and shouted anti-Israeli comments at people they believed to be Jews while brandishing a deadly weapon. In Bal Harbor, Florida, Eric Organ said he was walking with his family while vacationing when 4 men in an SUV began yelling anti-Semitic comments. Organ was wearing a yarmulke. The men shouted "Free Palestine" and "Die Jew," as well as threats to rape his wife and daughter. They threw garbage at the family. Feces has been left outside of a synagogue. Another man torched a Jewish community center. Synagogues in some places are now hiring armed security. I could go on, but it's not necessary because the big picture is that officials say hate crimes against Jews are growing dramatically in the aftermath of the recent Israeli-Palestinian flare-up and violence. We are witnessing a dangerous and drastic surge in anti-Jewish hate, said the head of the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League has identified 193 reports of anti-Jewish incidents in the last week, 135 reports the week before. And the point here is, and I really wish that some of the anti-Israeli people understood this, when Israel does something and Jews around the world, many of whom have never been to Israel, most of whom have never been to Israel, are attacked on the streets, it makes more and more people say, wow, I might have to move to Israel someday. I hope people understand this. If you really want to help make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and get more people on your side, like me fighting for a safe and fair situation for Israelis and Palestinians, lifting the blockade, stopping the settlements, getting leaders on both sides that actually care about the people in a real way, right? Don't do stuff that makes Jewish people say, holy, it's insane out there. I might need to move to Israel to feel safe. This is the great conundrum. The more of this stuff that goes on, the more people will say, I don't care what Israel does because I might need to flee there someday. And we saw this in Europe as anti-Semitism exploded under Trump, not because of Trump, but during the Trump era, we saw the far-right nationalist movements in Europe and anti-Semitism. The desire to move to Israel for safety went up. So the best thing that these people can do, if they can put their anti-Semitism on hold for a second, is don't make random Jews around the world feel unsafe. Don't make Jews on the streets of New York City feel so unsafe that they say, I might have to move to Israel to be safe. Okay, so it's an incredible conundrum and so counterproductive and obviously toxic and disgusting. So listen, I know what a lot of the reaction will be to me doing this segment. But I can't not say anything about it. Let me know your thoughts. You can find me on Twitter at dpacman. Monday, Memorial Day, we're doing a one-day membership special. I would love for you to sign up today at joinpacman.com. But if you want to wait for just an insanely crazy coupon code to get a big discount off of membership, Monday, Memorial Day is the day. We'll be sending out our newsletter on Monday morning with a incredibly, I mean, I would call it an immoral coupon code. It's that cheap. Get on my newsletter at davidpacman.com and you'll be notified Monday morning. Listen, they simply will not stop. Another ballot audit is set to go forward in Fulton County, Georgia. And yes, this is for the 2020 presidential election. Now, let's sit back for a second and review. Yes, obviously, Joe Biden won Georgia. Yes, obviously, even if Biden lost Georgia, he would still have the necessary 270 electoral votes to be president of the United States. Yes, obviously, the Georgia results have been certified and confirmed and recounted and audited for Joe Biden multiple times, and nothing can change now. And yes, obviously, Joe Biden has been president for months, and this is an absurd and humiliating fiasco for Republicans, but they will not stop. CNN reports that another ballot audit, or ARDIT, as some say, is set to move ahead in Georgia's most populous county after a judge ruled Friday that absentee ballots could be unsealed for parties looking to examine them for evidence of fraud. Georgia Republicans plan to bring in 6 so-called experts. By the way, sometimes you see these experts and you say, dear God. They're going to bring in 6 experts to look at the ballots and see if they can determine whether there are characteristics pointing to counterfeit ballots. Now, remember, Georgia counties already did the initial count, a hand audit, a rescan of each ballot, and every single one of those actions confirmed that Joe Biden won Georgia. You know who loves this decision, though, about doing another audit? Former Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, who was handily defeated by now Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock. She refers to him as radical liberal Raphael Warnock. She applauded this new audit saying, quote, voter confidence in our election system is the bedrock of our republic. Unfortunately, inconsistencies in Fulton County's November 2020 absentee ballots cast serious doubt on voters' faith in our elections. Now, one upside here, just for hilarity, is that they won't even be given the real ballots to review. I love this. They will be given scanned images of the ballots. I don't know why I love that, but they're not even going to let them put their hands on the actual ballots. Now, this wouldn't be so much an audit, but an attempt to tamper, really. So it's probably smart not to give them actual ballots, but just the signed images. And I read one commentary about this that says, allowing this to go forward is a mistake because it's yet another seed of doubt that gets planted in the minds of those who want to believe this was stolen. Something that might convince someone that there was fraud. I think that ship has long sailed. If you think there was fraud, you think there was fraud and none of this stuff matters. You just think there was fraud. Most people have moved on. And another pseudo audit or forensic examination of, remember when they wanted to look at bamboo fibers in Arizona or whatever? I don't think it'll really make a difference at this point in public opinion. Now, what is the latest that a judge could even allow them to do something? Like, could you continue auditing and reviewing ballots from 2020 beyond the 2022 midterms? I have no idea. I don't know how long it's possible for this to go on. And of course, the troubling part of all of this is you really can't prove a negative. And we've done a lot of stories about how conspiracy theories work and conspiracism and conspiratorial thinking. When they find nothing for the second time and the third time and the fourth time and the fifth time, they, instead of saying there's probably nothing to find, they say, they've done a really good job of hiding it. If we did a sixth audit, we would then find the smoking gun that we're waiting for. The fact that we've not found anything in 4 reviews is only evidence that they've hidden the fraud really, really well. And as I've said before, healthy skepticism is good and thinking for ourselves is good and understanding what is the foundation of a belief. How did I come to believe a certain thing? That's all good. Never-ending skepticism. If you never want to be satisfied, you can find a way to never be satisfied. And that's exactly what they are doing here. And a real hallmark of conspiracy theorists is that evidence for something counts as evidence, and lack of evidence for that thing also counts as evidence because hiding the evidence is part of the plan. And if you don't reason your way into a belief, you're not going to get reasoned out of it. And I've said that many times before, and that's clearly a case of what's going on here. But they're continuing to keep going. That's in Georgia. And we also have some more interesting news now out of Arizona. You guys know that phrase, when it rains, it pours? It just won't stop pouring for Donald Trump's former lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. There's a new report that Rudy Giuliani reportedly called an Arizona official about getting the election challenge, quote, fixed up so that Donald Trump would win Arizona back during the 2020 election. Now, remember that flipping Arizona alone would not have given Donald Trump the presidency anyway. Remember that Rudy Giuliani is already under a major investigation. His home and his office were raided just a few weeks ago. And now this, the Arizona Republic revealed on Sunday that Rudy Giuliani called the Maricopa County supervisor, Bill Gates, not the Microsoft guy, just a guy with the same name, on Christmas Eve of 2020, to introduce himself as the lawyer for Donald Trump. He left an incredible message. It's almost mafia-like about getting this situation resolved for everybody. Check out this quote. The Arizona newspaper obtained the audio and published a transcript. Rudy left a message saying, quote, "Bill, it's Rudy Giuliani, President Trump's lawyer. If you get a chance, would you please give me a call? I have a few things I'd like to talk over with you. Maybe we can get this thing fixed up. I really think it's a shame that Republicans sort of are both in this kind of situation. And I think there may be a nice way to resolve this for everybody." Why does every Rudy Giuliani quote throughout this entire thing sound like something you'd expect to hear on The Sopranos, not from the lawyer to a sitting president of the United States? The difference is I would imagine that a real mobster wouldn't leave a message like this on a phone with their real name and speaking so explicitly about what it is that they want. It would be, someone shows up at the house of this Maricopa County supervisor and says, hey, our friend in DC says he wants to talk about the Arizona thing and get it fixed up. You understand? But no, Rudy just does it. He does it without any hesitation. He just does it via voicemail. And Gates has since been asked about the voicemail and said, I never returned Rudy's call, explaining that, quote, we don't do what is easy. We do what is right. What's scary about that is the implication that it would have been easy to just flip the results and give the state to Trump. I hope that's not what Supervisor Gates actually means here. Now, many of you have been emailing me regularly saying, how is Rudy not in jail already? There are many answers to that question. The first is people like Rudy don't tend to go to jail. We have a two-tier justice system, and people like Rudy tend not to end up in jail or in prison. Second is that the investigation that's currently ongoing was significantly obstructed by Trump appointees to the Justice Department when Trump was president. They are now coming out and saying Biden got Rudy's home and office raided. No, actually, the investigation started when Trump was still president, and they tried to get a search warrant all the way back then. But Trump appointees in the Justice Department obstructed it and blocked it and prevented it from happening. So this all would have happened under Trump had Trump's loyalists in the Justice Department not interfered. And third, I just don't think Rudy Giuliani is going to prison, period. And whenever I say that, people are angry, or people say, David, you should at least optimistically say, let's hope Rudy goes to prison. Okay, if Rudy committed crimes for which he is found guilty, I hope he's given prison time. That would be just after everything that he's been involved in. I don't believe Rudy's going to prison. I don't believe Trump is going to prison. And so I'm not going to gaslight you and tell you that I think that that's a realistic possibility. That's just what it is. If you disagree, if you think that there's some real way that Rudy Giuliani ends up in prison, and to be perfectly frank, even if Rudy's charged and doesn't plead out and is found guilty at Rudy's age and for this type of crime, I think that once you get to sentencing, he doesn't get sent to prison anyway, even with multiple guilty verdicts. I just don't see it. Okay, if you disagree, let me know. And we're going to have more coverage of this on the David Pakman Show Instagram, which you can find at David Pakman Show. If you want to see a really wacky, and I mean weaponized, hate mail that I received last night, find it on my personal Instagram, david.pakman. All right, quick break, right back after this. It's great to welcome back to the program today Dr. Isaac Bogoch, who is an infectious diseases physician and scientist based out of the University of Toronto and Toronto General Hospital. It's so great to have you back on today.
Thanks for having me back on. Great to see you again, David.
So we could start in many different places. I mean, let's just start with an overview. We're starting to see vaccination accelerate in a lot of different places. We're seeing it in Canada, the United States. Europe seems to be about 5.5, 6 weeks behind where the United States is, and other places as well. Cases are starting to decline globally, and then certainly much more precipitously in some particular countries. The big question everybody has is this the end? And if so, the end of what, right? And is this going to go from being pandemic to seasonal? What's like the big picture assessment right now?
I think the big picture assessment is, as you point out, some places are much farther along than others. United Kingdom, Israel, United States are clearly far ahead. You see cases plummeting. You see life slowly, and in some places not so slowly, returning back to normal. The rest of the world is either a few months behind or sadly, a year to a year and a half to even 2 years behind. It's going to take a while. I really hope the countries that are further along start to look more globally, start to think more about low-income countries and low-middle-income countries around the world that just don't have the same access to vaccines. I hope we start to pour tons of time, tons of energy, tons of resources, tons of vaccines into the COVAX program to really help, from a global equity standpoint, help vaccinate those less fortunate than us. But, in general, I do see the pendulum slowly, from a global standpoint, shifting toward things getting better. Cases are starting to drop in some of the more high-burden areas like Brazil and India. They're still a long way away from where they need to be, but at least they might be heading in the right direction. And, quite frankly, vaccines are here. Like, we're in the vaccine era. We now have tools to prevent this, to prevent people from getting sick, to prevent people from dying. We just have to get We have to mass produce those and get those all over the world, which is, easy to say, but actually hard to do.
One of the common questions, maybe the biggest question right now around vaccines is, what about the variants? And we've had the British variant, South African, Brazilian, New York, California, India. From what I've been reading, the current major variants are all, the way I am reading it, is well enough handled by the current vaccines. Doesn't mean there's no escape versus the sort of original, live version for which the vaccines were made, but that if we vaccinate quickly enough, these vaccines are good enough. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I see it the same way too. Basically, if we think about the first generation vaccines that we have, again, in the United States, Canada, and Europe, they're either really, really good or good enough. And that's fine, because quite frankly, if you can turn a potentially lethal infection into the sniffles, you're doing something right? You don't have the same public health emergency that you would have when, the virus runs unchecked and obviously preys upon everybody, but really significantly on those on the older end of the spectrum or people with underlying medical conditions. So I think the vaccines that we have are absolutely fantastic. Obviously, the elephant in the room is, listen, when you've got unchecked transmission in some parts of the world, there's always the concern that you may develop a virus that escapes the vaccine, and we don't have that yet. Great. I have no idea if that will happen, but that's the concern. But we don't have that. And quite frankly, I think, as you point out, the key message here is vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. We just have to roll these out to as many people all over the planet as fast as possible to get some degree of community level protection. And again, you don't have to have that mythical herd immunity level. You just have to have good rates in the community to really slow this down. You'll protect individuals, you'll protect populations, and that's the right path forward. I think the other point on this is we're going to get a booster. We all know it. They're already starting to make it. The boosters really start to account for some of the variants of concern. Probably something we're going to be talking about either in very late 2021 or in early 2022.
Right.
But beyond that, it's not entirely clear what the frequency of vaccines is going to be. But I think it's fair to say that we're going to get 2 doses now, or one with the Johnson & Johnson, and at least 1 dose later on. Hopefully that's it, but there may be more.
So last time you were on, we talked a little bit about masks and outdoor versus indoor. And I if I recall correctly, you and I seem to be in agreement. Not that my opinion matters as much as yours, but from what I read, it seemed to go along with the things you believe about outside transmission is very, very low. But we are team players. And so when the guidelines were you wear a mask everywhere, I was doing it even on the bike path and so on and so forth, even if I didn't really think that was where a lot of the spread was. We've since found out, Dr. Ashish Jha from Brown published something saying that pre-vaccine, maybe 1 out of 1,000 cases was being transmitted outdoors. And that was probably pretty obvious situations where you're outdoors, but doing something you probably shouldn't be doing. In the US, the CDC has since said, if you're vaccinated, you don't really need a mask outdoors. Then they've since gone to, if you're vaccinated, really, you don't need a mask at all, but follow what your state says or follow what a particular retailer says. Things are different in Canada for sure. Some reactions have been, that new guidance is crazy. Kids aren't vaccinated yet. The vaccines aren't 100%, et cetera, et cetera. What's your general reaction to the speed with which the CDC has moved in the U.S.?
Listen, I'm a big fan of the new CDC under Dr. Rochelle Walensky. Yeah, I get that this is always going to be a contentious issue. People are going to have very strong opinions one way or another, but I tend to align with them, right? I mean, this is the point of vaccines. Right? This is what they do, and now they're doing it. They were supposed to, A, prevent you from getting the infection, and B, if you're unlucky enough to get the infection, ensure that you have a very mild illness, and C, reduce the likelihood that if you're unlucky enough to get the infection, that you transmit the infection to others. We do not live in a zero-risk world, especially in the COVID era. Now you have these phenomenal vaccines that are extremely effective, but of course, they're not 100% perfect. I totally think that when you have a significant degree of vaccination in your community, in this case in the United States. No, of course you don't have 100% uptake, nor will you ever get to that state, but you have a ton of people that have a first dose, you have a ton of people that have a second dose, you already have excellent trial data and real world experience with these vaccines. Great. I think it's very reasonable. If you're fully vaccinated, like, why do you need to wear a mask?
And then what about the issue of kids, right? Where if you're nobody under 12 has been vaccinated, they just started Pfizer 12 plus. That's something I hear from parents who say, well, I will keep wearing a mask because the kids aren't vaccinated, even if I am. Does that make sense scientifically?
Not really. Like, let's think about it. This goes beyond science and more into value judgments, right? Let's just think about this critically. If a parent is fully vaccinated, okay, you've got your 2 doses of, I don't know, Moderna or Pfizer or something like that. Can you get the infection? Yes, but it's unlikely. If you're infected, will you get really sick? No, but it's not impossible. If you are infected, can you transmit it to your kid? It's always possible. It's just very, very unlikely. So these are people's value judgments. That's totally, totally fine if people's risk threshold or risk perception or risk tolerance is as such where they feel that they still want to wear a mask. Great. I would never shame or blame anyone from wearing a mask. I think the whole point here is to enable people to make informed decisions for themselves. I think it's also fair to enable people to say, listen, if you're fully vaccinated, here's the risks. If you choose to not wear a mask, that's also okay too. We're in a bit of a wild west right now, right? Rapidly emerging data, rapidly vaccinating large segments of the population. Policy has got to keep up with science, and that means it's going to change quickly with time. Here's one that caught some people off guard. It's still a reasonable policy, but again, there's no shaming, there's no blaming. If you want to wear a mask, great. If you want to take your mask off, great. As long as you're making an informed decision, you're doing something right.
The last piece of this was in the US, there's a significant anti-vaccine community, which overlaps with Donald Trump voters, at least for the time being. And the concern was, now that the CDC said vaccinated people don't need to wear masks, unvaccinated people will just lie and not wear masks. And the debate was, are they only putting themselves at risk or are they putting others at risk? And it's really a statistical question, right?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say they're putting themselves at risk. And of course, they're putting others at risk as well. This is one of those situations. I mean this with love and respect. Like, I really don't mean any ill will toward anyone. But if we look at the United States and the situation there, vaccines are so widely available to the point where some are even being discarded, right?
Yes.
If you're any walk of life, it's available. Like, it's in pharmacies, it's in doctor's offices. If you go to the emergency department for an unrelated issue, you'll get one on the way out. It's in the subway stations. Like, they're everywhere. Okay. We often talk about equity in vaccine allocation and distribution, but like, it's true. Like, the barriers to getting a vaccine are really, really low for almost all walks of life. It's not perfect, but it's pretty clear that almost anyone can get a vaccine. So that's point one. Point two is, some people are going to choose to get a vaccine. Some people are going to choose not to get a vaccine. Great. Your choice, your body, mazel tov. But the third point is, this is such a contagious infection that people who choose not to get vaccinated, your luck's going to run out eventually, right? Your luck's going to run out. There's just so much of this virus everywhere, globally, even in the United States. Like, people will sadly get infected eventually if they choose not to get vaccinated. And again, I don't wish ill on anyone, but it's going to reach a point where you've said, listen, we've given everybody ample opportunity to get a vaccine. You can change your mind. You can get a vaccine anywhere you want. You've chosen not to. That's your choice. That's your decision. But like, we know what happens. Like, you don't need a crystal ball to look in the future and see that many of those individuals, sadly, who are either on the older end of the spectrum or have medical conditions, are going to get sick and land in hospital, and some of them are going to die. And, that's awful. That's awful because it's completely preventable.
Yeah. I've been stressing to my audience, there are countries that have no vaccines right now.
Yeah.
There are countries that they get a shipment of 100,000 and they're thrilled with 100,000 vaccines. We have so many vaccines in the United States and increasingly in other countries as well, Canada, Europe, getting more and more vaccines. And, 40% of Trump voters just don't want to get one. It's almost insulting. It's disgusting. I don't know what the right word to attach to it is.
I mean, it's it's perplexing. It's mind-boggling. It's sad, and sometimes you just start blaming yourself, like, oh, as a medical or as a scientific or as a public health community, we haven't done enough. I mean, obviously, it's more complicated than this, right? This is truly going to be a struggle moving forward. I mean, first of all, this predated COVID-19, and this issue will be along well after COVID-19 is an afterthought. But we really have to fight a better fight on social media and in mainstream media and in regular conversations to enable people to make appropriate decisions for themselves based on data, fact, logic, science, right? Like, listen, I truly am all for people making individual decisions for themselves. I would never want to coerce people. I would never want to counterbalance extreme misinformation against vaccines with extreme misinformation on the other side of the spectrum. Just be honest. Just present the data in a meaningful, digestible manner. And the key here is communication in an age, language, and culturally appropriate manner that's easily digestible. But again, I mean, look what we're up against. We're up against, social media, which I know they say they're trying to combat this misinformation, but like, it's a huge failure. We're up against, people who dig in their heels and cultural norms. Like, this is going to be an uphill battle. And sadly, lives are going to be lost. And it's not an insignificant number of lives. Like, this is going to be measured in the thousands and thousands, or quite frankly, in the 10,000s of lives, probably even more. I mean, there's 500,000 Americans died, right? Yeah. 500,000 people died from this. And how many more are going to die because of misinformation and pseudoscience that's being amplified online?
Yeah, and the real number, officially 600,000, probably in reality 30 to 40% more. It's probably close to 1 million deaths is the real number. To follow up on a couple of other things that when we last spoke, we were still learning about. The primary mode of transmission here in terms of location, we learned outdoor is close to zero. The bleaching of the bananas and stuff like that, that was not a source of contagion. Is it people indoors breathing on each other? Is that really what this is?
Yes. Safe to say that the vast majority of this infection is transmitted indoors with people in close contact with each other. Can you still get this infection indoors while far away from someone else? Sure you can. There's, tons of case reports and examples of this, but primarily close contact indoors. Doesn't have to be for, that magic number of 15 minutes. You can have a high exposure fleeting contact. It's gross to think about, but if someone like coughs in your face indoors, you're going to get this infection, even if it's for a second. Yeah. Indoor, like, it's safe to say, to oversimplify it, outdoor safe, indoor not safe. It's basically as easy as that. And policy can align with that. Ventilate indoor spaces, put on a mask indoors. Pretty straightforward stuff.
And it seems that the X factor for indoors, from some studies I've read, really seems to be the type of ventilation, that you have these situations where even with larger distances between people, certain types of ventilation that are basically moving the virus around can lead to people 20 feet away actually getting it. But that again, we're now starting to slice and dice even smaller sort of situations.
I agree completely. I mean, you can get this infection indoors. It's primarily indoors. I mean, distance certainly helps. It does. You can't ignore the fact that distance helps, that masks help. But most of this virus appears to be transmitted indoors in close contact with one another. Masks will help. Ventilation will help. But at the end of the day, like, let's just get vaccinated. That's really our ticket out of this. We're not supposed to say there's a silver bullet, but there is. The vaccines are the silver bullet. Like, right. That is protecting people, protecting communities. It's phenomenal to watch some of the real world data emerge from places in the United States, from Israel, from the United Kingdom, where you just vaccinate a significant proportion of your population. You follow up with a second dose and you watch cases plummet. Like, it's just remarkable. It's remarkable. And when we're talking about respiratory viral infections, I'm fully aware that this is not the flu, but often we'll say, well, let's look at influenza vaccines. And influenza vaccines are like they're come see, come saw. I mean, but like they don't have effectiveness. They're not like 95% effective. Right?
No.
They're sometimes, 20, 30, 40, 50% effective, depending on the year. You've got COVID-19 vaccines that are like 90% effective for a contagious respiratory virus. Like, that's remarkable. Like,
It's incredible.
These really are transform. Oh my God, it's amazing. And the fact that, we're some people are saying, well, this vaccine is, 94 and this one was 92%. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, we're talking about vaccines that are, over 60% effective for a contagious respiratory virus. That's remarkable in and of itself. So these are incredible vaccines, and they truly are transforming the pandemic.
Yeah, even I was just reading today about the possibility now of an mRNA-based flu vaccine, which could also be a game changer on those, 20 to 50% numbers. It's really incredible. We've been speaking with Dr. Isaac Bogoch, who's an infectious disease physician and scientist based out of the University of Toronto and Toronto General Hospital. Always great catching up with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
All right, this is truly one of my favorite fail clips from the last week. On the Fox News show, Fox and Friends, Steve Doocy, who has never struck anybody as being particularly with it, let's be honest about Doocy, he tried citing the number of COVID deaths and people affected nationally by the virus. But what came out of his mouth didn't make any sense, and he sort of seems to realize it. Now, you may know that in the United States, more than 33 million people have officially gotten the virus. The real number is probably more like 65 million. And more than 600,000 people officially have died. And yet in this segment, Steve Doocy says, here in the U.S., 52,000 people have died and 2 million people have been affected by COVID. And as he says it, you see a sort of strange look on his face. And at one point, he looks off screen to his right, almost as if someone's flagging him, as if he realizes that what he's saying makes no sense, but he just can't seem to get back on track. So check it out.
Think about it this way, folks. Here in the United States of America, 52,000 Americans have died from COVID. 52,000. I was shocked to see that 33,000 of them actually lived here in New York City, which is shocking. 2 million Americans have been impacted. So how did it come to infect the entire planet?
So this, of course, makes no sense. And what appears to have happened is that Doocy was trying to give the COVID numbers for New York State, not for the United States, which are close to the numbers he gave. In the state of New York, indeed, 53,000 people have died of the virus, about 2.1 million official cases. And later in the show, Doocy corrected himself. He was apparently confused. And he is also a clown. The correction, hilariously, came during a segment about what else? Of course, cancel culture. Now, a ton of people wrote to me saying, David, this isn't a mistake. This was, as usual, trying to throw in a low number and then correcting so that it doesn't look as though Trump failed as bad. No, I don't think so. I think this was just a mistake. I think Doocy didn't realize that the numbers he was giving made no sense until he said it. And then he sort of realized it. I don't believe that this is nefarious. I think it's the constant confusion happening at Fox News and the constant confusion going on in the brain of Steve Doocy. The only strange thing about the clip is that no one immediately said in his earpiece, New York, not U.S., New York, not U.S., and that he could have immediately corrected it and said, sorry, that's in New York State, not in the United States. That is weird. I admit that. I don't have an explanation for that. But this is actually an opportunity to remind you, the official numbers are nowhere near the real estimated number of COVID cases and deaths. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. First, we can talk about cases, then we can talk about deaths. One study suggests that cases, which are officially 33 million, could be 2 to 3 times that number. So 33 million official cases, the real US number could be 66 million or 99 million. Why? A bunch of different reasons. Early on, before we even knew about this virus as a separate virus from the flu, there were tons of people who had symptoms. There were no tests available at that point in time, or not enough tests. They tested for flu, came back negative, and just were told, go home, it's probably some virus. That's a whole bunch of people in January 2020, February 2020, March, even into April. I don't exactly remember. Was it end of April, early May when testing really ramped up? So there's a whole bunch of people who tested negative for the flu or never got a test whatsoever. Also, ton of asymptomatic cases. Now, the relevance of an asymptomatic case, you might say, well, we didn't capture in the data a lot of those asymptomatic cases, but they also don't really matter. Okay, that's a debate, but that's another reason why the 33 million number is very low. People who had an asymptomatic case or an almost asymptomatic case may never have thought to get tested. So real number of cases anywhere from 2 to 3 times the official number. Deaths. One study suggests that the real number of COVID deaths could be not 2 to 3 times the official number, but could be 30 to 40% higher than the official number. One study says it could be 50% higher. How could that be? A bunch of different reasons. One, there is a degree to which sometimes someone dies and it's just not being reported locally as a COVID death. Number two, there are people who died in their homes where they were never posthumously tested for COVID, and they are sort of what we would call presumed cases, but not necessarily known cases. So also a multiplier. If you take the official number of COVID deaths, if you want to get to the real number, maybe you multiply by 1.3, 1.4, maybe 1.5. So Steve Ducey, yes, constant confusion going on there, whatever. But an opportunity to remind you that even when we look at the official numbers and we say, here's how bad it was, and we make a judgment about that, the real numbers are probably 30 to 50% more deaths and 2 to 3 times more cases. This is absolutely bizarre for a number of reasons. Donald Trump's indicted former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who has since been pardoned and is a total out and out conspiracy theorist, appeared on some right-wing show a few days ago and claimed that, yes, the election was stolen, and yes, COVID was a conspiracy, and all of this stuff. But as crazy as all of that is, he drops in, he's not worried because he's been on hydroxychloroquine for 30 years. What? Why has he been on hydroxychloroquine for 30 years? And why would you need to be on hydroxychloroquine if COVID is a hoax anyway? None of it makes sense. Why has he been taking the virus? Why has he been taking the medication? What did he know in 1991 at age 32 that would start him on a 30-year course of hydroxychloroquine? Just some of the questions that come up. Let's take a listen to Michael Flynn.
And because when you look around the world and you go, well, all these other places, why aren't all these other places having the kinds of problems that we keep getting beat over the head and shoulders on in this country about when it comes to COVID? Why? Because everything, and this is my truth, but what I believe, everything is a distraction to what happened on the 3rd of November. So everything that we hear about COVID, and that COVID started before the 3rd of November, but it was all meant to control. It's all meant to gain control of a society, to be able to force decisions on the society instead of actually allowing we the people to make decisions.
Imagine for a moment, and this is the tragedy. That guy was the National Security Advisor of the United States for a period of time. Okay. I've heard from other people the idea COVID was created / released to make Trump lose the election. This is one of the conspiracies that doesn't even make sense in terms of the motive. Sometimes you have a bad conspiracy theory and all they have is motive. They have no facts, but at least the motive sort of might work to convince you that it's a possible conspiracy. COVID was created to make Trump lose the American election doesn't even pass the sniff test because there's no guarantee that COVID would make a world leader up for re-election lose if they handled the virus correctly. Never mind that we've had 600,000 official deaths. The world has had 3.5 million official deaths. Most of the deaths are not in the US. So Flynn is wrong that we are mostly affected and everybody else is fine. Most of the deaths have been in other countries. Second, if you handle COVID well, you get yourself reelected. Look at New Zealand, where Jacinda Ardern handled the virus beautifully, easily got reelected, and New Zealand was able to reopen much earlier than the United States. So to assume Trump loses because of COVID is sort of silly unless you assume Trump would mishandle it, which isn't as crazy, but it still goes against the idea of what Michael Flynn is saying. But then he casually mentions, I've been on hydroxychloroquine for 30 years.
And now with the vaccine as an example, right? Whatever happened to the women's movement out there for the my body, my choice? But yet they want to stick a needle in my arm to tell me that, well, if you don't have that needle, you can't get an ID card, you can't travel. Wait a second. I'm as healthy as the next person. I've been taking hydrochloroquine for 30 years. Oh.
Okay, so by the way, more lies there. No one has said you can't get a state ID if you don't get a vaccine. And in terms of travel, there are countries that are putting in place a vaccine requirement for COVID vaccine. For decades and decades, different countries have had different vaccine requirements. That's nothing new, okay? But hydroxychloroquine for 30 years? Michael Flynn is 62 years old right now, meaning 30 years ago, he would have been 32 and it would have been 1991. Why did he start taking hydroxychloroquine in 1991 at 32 years of age? Has he had arthritis since age 32? One of the reasons sometimes people take hydroxychloroquine. Has he been persistently exposed to malaria for the last 30 years where he needs to constantly be on hydroxychloroquine? Has he had lupus since age 32? Another reason why sometimes you would take hydroxychloroquine. If you take it for just 5 years, you need to get regular eye exams because it can cause retinopathy. And Michael Flynn claims that he's been on hydroxychloroquine for 30 years. Or is Michael Flynn implying that as a prophylactic of some kind, he's been taking hydroxychloroquine for 30 years, which just makes no sense whatsoever? And I got one funny email, which was, maybe 30 years of hydroxychloroquine have caused some kind of toxicity. And that explains all of Michael Flynn's bizarre behavior, the paranoid delusions, the conspiracy theories, all of it. I don't know. And to come back again to the entire COVID hoax thing, if it's a hoax, why do you need to take anything? Why take hydroxychloroquine for something that's not real, if that's indeed what you believe? And of course, by hoax, they always mean different things. Sometimes by hoax, they mean it's not really a virus and nobody's dying from it. By hoax, sometimes they mean, no, it's a real virus and people are dying, but it was deliberately released to have a political impact either on the United States or the world or whatever the case may be. It's never clear. Their conspiracy theories conflict. But what is abundantly clear here is that Michael Flynn is completely off the rails. And it is terrifying that that guy at one point was the primary and most important advisor on the topic of national security to the president of the United States. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192 David P. You can call the voicemail number anytime you want. And here's a really good question about all of these so-called voter integrity measures that Republicans have been and want to continue passing. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, these voter suppression tactics, it's kind of hard to find the statistical analysis on their effect. Could you share what percentage do they estimate that these tactics prevent illegal voting or versions of that, and what percentage of voters who want to vote are unable to vote because they've been purged from a voter roll or other suppression tactic where they said they were unable to vote? I'm just assuming that they estimate that based on polls or something else.
Yeah, so this is a good question, which is all this stuff Republicans do, legally speaking, in order to prevent illegal voting. How much illegal voting does it actually prevent versus how many legal voters end up being disenfranchised, which is really the design of it. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that in-person voter fraud is a materially significant issue. Now, it's important to say materially significant because Republicans will hear that and they'll write in and they'll say, what about Jim Bob who voted twice? Or what about Bobby Sue who figured out how to vote under her cousin's name or whatever? The question is, in a country of 331 million people, there are examples of everything. Is there any evidence that all of these in-person types of voter fraud are materially significant to election results? And the answer is no. On the other hand, we know of tons of people who were purged from voter rolls for so-called inactivity, who were denied the ability to vote because of other clerical issues that were caused by these guidelines and restrictions put in place by Republicans. There are people who opted just not to even go and vote because Republicans disproportionately shut down voting booths and curtail voting hours in disproportionately Democratic areas. So the Brennan Center for Justice has a lot of great data on this. And the most important takeaway is the voter suppression tactics from Republicans, because that's what they are, which they claim to be in the spirit of preventing illegal votes. They do way more to interfere with people legally voting than they do to curb what is almost insignificant, almost non-existent and statistically insignificant in-person voter fraud. The real way that you affect elections is by suppressing the vote at the big picture level. You don't flip an election by going with your friends to multiple polling places and claiming to be different people. You don't go and round up the people who are juniors and say, even though your dad's senior is dead, go and vote for yourself and for your dad. No, that's not how you steal an election. Just doesn't happen. And the question is well asked and really gets to the heart of that. We have a great bonus show for you today. Teenagers are helping each other get COVID shots when their parents are anti-vax. Fascinating that this is what's going on. The defiant action of teenagers is to get themselves vaccinated even when their parents don't want them to. Unbelievable. Trials to suck carbon dioxide from the air are going to start across the United Kingdom. And the Texas Senate has approved a bill limiting how race and racism can be taught in public school classrooms. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. I would love it if you joined us on the bonus show. Pat will be joining me. Why don't you join me as well? You can get instant access by signing up at joinpatman.com.